Warning: Superpower review is intended for a mature viewing audience. This video may show images that are not suitable for kids under 13 years old. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hey, what's going on everybody? It's Kevin Vidini here for Superpower Review, and I want to thank you so much for clicking play on today's video. I have a very special guest for today's video, but before I introduce my guest, I just want to remind you guys to smash that like button if you like today's content, comment some feedback that you may have in the comment section, and lastly, please subscribe to the channel to show your support. I'm going to be giving away this Spawn #1 CGC graded at a 9.4 once the channel reaches 2,000 subscribers. Now let me introduce my guest. My guest has worked for comic book companies such as Malibu Comics, IDW Publishing, DC Comics, and Marvel Comics. He is also the founder of the Inkwell Awards that honors and recognizes comic book inkers. My guest today is comic book artist Bob Almond. All right, Bob, thank you so much for joining us today on Superpower Review. I really appreciate your time, sir. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for your patience, and I'm so glad to be here.
Bob, so we have some questions for you here, and one of the first questions I have, what is your earliest memory you have with comic books?
Well, that brings us back to the late 1976. My dad used to go into the magazine shop nearby, and he started coming home with 3 comics a week, which cost him less than $1 a time.
Yeah.
And I realized very quickly that I was enjoying the Marvel selections much more than the DC ones. Very quickly, I found myself a big fan of books like Avengers, Fantastic Four. I found that George Perez was like my Kirby of my generation. The dynamic layouts, the power behind his work really affected me. After a while, I was getting together with my fellow nerd friends of mine who were already Fantastic Four or Spider-Man or X-Men fans, and we started producing our own homemade comics, which was Torpedo Comic. And that was from late elementary school until just starting high school. Wow. We used the Marvel characters and made up our own stories. It was a training ground of sorts, but we didn't quite understand, I think, how to use specific tools. So, I mean, it was like drawing and using razor point markers to darken the drawings, which isn't really inking, and we used like colored pencil. So it was pretty rough looking, and I used to have all of them, but it set me for life as a fan and collector. And I've never stopped really collecting.
How did you get into the comic industry, Bob? And what was your first work as a comic book inker?
What happened was I went to a local art school, UMass Dartmouth. But I did, at least get to educate myself with figure drawing and some painting and using all kinds of tools, being an illustration major. I graduated in 1990, and I had been working in fast food to pay the bills, and I was a manager there, and simultaneously, one of my college products in the mid to late 80s was to do an interview with somebody, a professional illustrator, to do art in their style and to do a paper on their life and career. And a friend of mine who was working at a local comic franchise had some contact numbers, asked me to pick among them, and the one I picked stuck right out to me was Bernie Wrightson.
Wow, big name right there.
Yeah, but Bernie just popped out at me. I went with that. And it's funny because I just called him and his wife out of the blue to do an interview. And Bernie was home the next day, so we connected again. And at the end of the discussion, he invited me to his annual Halloween party in Saugerties, New York. So that led to me um, attending those events, which were mind-blowing, because the upper New York State community has a big comic book and artists in general community.
Yeah.
I mean, it's funny because I didn't have any connection at that time with Joe Sinnott, but Socrates is where he lived his whole life and got to, work with that later. But there's just tons of artists there, and I got to meet them and have fun, but I wasn't bringing my portfolio to show off because it just wasn't the appropriate venue. Mm-hmm. So I went up as many years as I could with my brother, a fellow geek, so he was having the time of his life. And after a while, they started having what they called critique parties, which they held like once a quarter with their neighbors and artist friends, which was basically an excuse to eat and drink. But you would bring your art in and lay it out in Bernie's studio, and people could go around and look at stuff. But I mean, there was very little critiquing. I mean, you're not going to critique Bernie Wrightson and artists of his ilk.
No.
But like I said, just an excuse to get together. And because it was a different themed event, I did bring my portfolio once out of the 2 or 3 of those events I did. And Bernie had informed me that, he has returned to working in the sequential medium for a bit, but he didn't feel like he was very familiar with the goings-on in the market. So he called over buddy Jim Starlin, who lived there at the time.
Wow. And
Jim had just returned to Marvel on Silver Surfer, returning Thanos and his other characters that he's known for. That was, I believe, in the late 80s. And this would have been around 1990, 91. And he looked over my stuff and it said, well, listen, why don't I give you a call and we'll take it from there. He turned out sending me some photocopies from the first issue of Warlock and the Infinity Watch. They were photocopies of the pencils by Angel Medina. And he asked me to try to knock them off over a weekend just to test me for deadlines.
Yep.
The problem was I was on salary as a manager at Burger King, so I had a full weekend. I'm guessing I scheduled like 40 or 50 hours that weekend.
Wow.
And I was the first assistant, and I couldn't get up. Everybody else, no one else was available. They were on vacation or whatnot. So I pretty much had to put like all-nighters for the whole weekend. And I sent in what I got done with a typed letter. Obviously, this was before I could do so on the computer. And he told me that he got them. He's not sure what, how things will go. He'll talk to his editor and get back to me, but not hold my breath. So time went by, and then it was around October of 90. He called me up one night and he told me I could quit my Burger King job because he convinced his editor to hire me at Marvel.
When you get a phone call to work with Marvel, how does that feel?
Well, that call was pretty mind-blowing. I mean, I was like, oh my God, this is, he was telling me like the work would start being shipped to me. So I did get to experience at least the latter half of the real heyday of comic books. But the problem is, starting 94, 95 was when the rug was pulled out from under everyone. So I tried getting more work. I was doing regular train trips into the city, and I'm knocking on every door at the offices. Now, while I get some work from Marvel, they opened the door for me at Malibu Comics, and I worked there for about a year and a half. But all the while, in the first 10 years of my career, I was off and on getting work every year for about a decade. So that helped, but the 90s were rough from the middle to the late part of the decade.
What would you say is one of your best pieces of art? Like, what is the best time of Bob Almond?
Well, you mentioned the Black Panther work from my resume. That was the most important work, bar none. That was my last major project at Marvel during that decade. what had happened at Marvel was the Marvel Knights work by Quesada and Palminotti in '98. The first, it's the first year run, but it's a lot longer than a year. The artists, the creative team on Black Panther, after the initial 4 Mark Texeira issues, was just a rotating mess because they couldn't keep anybody to meet the deadlines, and they were changing artists every 3 issues. And then when it got to the end, Priest thought it was told or thought it was canceled. There was no announcement. There was no more issues coming out. But around the same time, coincidentally, editor Ruben Diaz, he inherited Black Panther, no longer Marvel Knights, but a Marvel Universe book, and hired us because, we came as a team. And we were told that, this may not last long, sales being what they are. There was a lot lost from just being a late book. I believe we were told the book was 5 months late when we got it. We had to get caught up first in the schedule. Within a few months, I can't remember what issue it was, we were able to get ourselves back on schedule. It might have been issue 17 or 19, but we did do that, which was an accomplishment. The reason this thing becomes much more than a simple job was, in his communications, he made very clear to Sal and myself, offer him as many suggestions of things we'd like to work on, characters we'd like to see, locations we'd like to visit, or themes and stories, things like that. And he was, to show his integrity, he used the majority of our suggestions. And starting with issue 19, instead of crediting us all as writer, penciler, inker, he just credited us 3 as storytellers.
Yep.
He wanted to make, put the message out there that the 3 of us were equally contributing to the material being produced. Now, inkers are not used to, doing much more than their job of enhancing their pencil partners. But in my case, and being a Marvel fanboy, and being that that's a classic Marvel character who had not, like a ridiculous Spider-Man or X-Men, convoluted continuity, I threw a lot of ideas at him, a lot of characters. I mean, it was more probably nostalgic motivated. When Marvel was doing the cinematic universe and Panther was announced to be an upcoming film, I contacted people to show them evidence where I had made above than usual contributions to the content that was printed in our run, material that was showing up in the film. Right. And I was able to convince them, because I said, if you're crediting Sal and Priest in the credits, I believe they deserve equal billing. But if they are not credited, do not put me in there. I'm only with them. And they agreed with that, and they not only credited us all, but they invited us over for the world premiere in LA in January 2018. So these are the reasons why that was the most important project of my career. And at the time, to close this off, I knew we were doing groundbreaking work at the time. It wasn't selling, even though it had award given to it, and it was highly acclaimed, and Marvel loved it and tried supporting it. I knew down the road it would be more appreciated for what Priest was doing, which was brilliant. Yep. And I was right. I think the only thing that I regret is, at the time I was like, well, this looks like our opus, but that kind of means it's all downhill from here. So I was always hoping that wasn't the case, and people can decide on that on their own, but that pretty much ends that part of the questioning in the story.
So, Bob, you mentioned, people like Bernie Wrightson, Jim Starlin. Were there any other comic book artists that you really looked up to, or they inspired you, or even mentored you?
When I was a fan, besides George Perez, who I credit as being the one single creator that made me realize this is what I want to do with my life, I was, prior to meeting him, a big Jim Starlin fan. I was also, Bernie Wrightson was mostly while I was in college. I knew of him a bit, but I didn't extensively know of him. He was an inspiration in that I collected almost everything he ever did for a while there. Michael Golden, I love that one. Frank Miller, John Byrne. A lot of the Marvel Bronze Age artists were the ones that inspired me. But on another side of things, because I ultimately broke in as an inker, after years of rejection, sending in submissions as a penciler, I realized that I needed to study a lot of these inkers that I was fond of, even as, you know, a reader. So my favorite inkers had been Joe Rubinstein, Terry Austin, Tom Palmer, Klaus Janson, Mark Farmer, Bob Wyacek, all those guys. And I studied them all the more. I got to talk to Austin and Rubinstein on the phone when my editor connected me when I had some questions. I was not taught like some inkers were, which is you become an assistant and you learn, you know, the trade until you can get your own professional work. I was just hired and told, okay, just like trace what's there in pencil. And which is ironic, being that's not exactly what you do as a professional inker, but being that I was learning on the job, it was more difficult. That's why I had more questions. And it took me about 5 years, I think, to really get a handle on it, which is what I was actually told by another inker I communicated with about this. And eventually, I got much more adept with different tools and combinations of them, and working with Sal, he had me try a whole bunch of other tools and ideas that I'd never considered before. So, yeah, I think it's a combination of my early inspirations and those inkers that made me realize, you know, what kind of look I wanted.
Another question I had for you now, you wear a lot of hats for the organization, the Inkwell Awards, which is an award ceremony that recognizes comic book inkers, and you are the director of the Inkwell Awards. Do you want to talk a little more about the Inkwell Awards and you know, what they do?
We talk a lot more about that. In the, you know, after I was struggling to survive and I was watching what was going on, a lot of things were happening around the same time from the late 90s into the 2000s. The Eisner Awards, our Academy Award comparison, dropped the inking category in their awards, saying it was too difficult to decipher where pencil ends and inking begins. And they consolidated pencil and inking into a category, which was described as Best Pencil Inker Artist or Pencil Inker Team, which was quite depressing and insulting for a lot of ink art community.
I can imagine, yeah.
Also, at the same time, Marvel, I think, was the first to really make a habit of it. They were, you know, learning new ways to go about production, and with the computer technology, they realized they could cut the inker out altogether in the production line by taking the penciler's work and going straight to the colorist, asking them to darken pencils in levels in Photoshop and cleaning things up, and then coloring over that. It saved money, but unfortunately, where inking used to be a requirement to have the artwork be capable printed, because the printing and the paper back then was so poor in the early days of comic books back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. By the time we were into the 90s, I mean, it was very obvious, you know, some projects had been printed straight from pencils and colored, but now it was becoming more prolific. But at that point, inking was more of a quality factor. You know, it had become an art form unto itself. So these books tended to look a little lackluster to my eyes. They didn't have the same punch, same definition. I mean, color artists justifiably deserve the additional credits they were able to get in the 90s.
Yeah.
But they're trained ink artists. So for them to enhance things, it wasn't along the same mindset of what ink artists do. Let's say, for example, X-Men Death of the Phoenix, one of the most famous arcs out there. It used to always have on the cover Claremont, Byrne, and Austin. All of a sudden, the inker's name was taken off it. Now, it wasn't a space problem. From what I understand, it wasn't even a monetary matter. Marketing at Marvel and DC around a particular time period just decided that since the inkers were not a draw to sales, that they didn't need to keep them there. So things like that were not recognized and rewarded for what it was, saving the butts of those editors. And so this really turned people off. I decided, because at that time I was writing a column for Sketch Magazine, which was is put together, I think, by Blue Line Pro, the board's producing people. And it was the articles were all inker-centric. And one of the articles, I did this hypothetical thing, you know, what if we were able to put together something called the Inkwell Awards? And all in all, a bunch of people in the community were like, why don't we really do this? We would back you up. We would join. We would help you. And I turned out founding it with people that have been involved with me, with the magazine, and we did it. I'm amazed we got it done, and I made sure to surround myself with as many capable and brilliant people.
Great. Well, Bob, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today. That's unfortunately all the time we have for today, but again, I want to thank you so much for joining in. Guys, thank you so much for being watching today. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.